It has been thought that the people here, the ancient mound builders in North America, didn't have a written language. And clearly the Book of Mormon talks about that the Nephites were literate. So if that's the case, then that would be very problematic. But it has been thought that the only literate civilization in the Americas was the Mayans. And certainly the Mayans had this pretty intensive glyph system that they were using, which is clearly a form of writing. And so people thought, well, it must be the Mayans then because they have a written language. And while it's true that the Mayans did have a written language, the written language that was specifically mentioned in the Book of Mormon on the plates was Reformed Egyptian. But Moroni, actually, the Methodist, said if we could just write in Hebrew, there would be no imperfections in our record. Which means that Hebrew was really their primary language. We know that the Lamanites were not keeping records, so we wouldn't expect to find records among the Lamanites. But there's no requirement from the Book of Mormon that all the Nephites were making records. Okay, they just had the records that were made by those who were the record keepers, and so forth. The people of King Benjamin, he had everything written down and then disseminated out to them, so obviously they were illiterate. So the language, if we were going to be looking for evidence for the language of the Book of Mormon, what language would we even be looking for? Well, it'd have to be Hebrew. Well, guess what? The Mayan glyph system is not Hebrew. It's not in any way related. In fact, the Hebrew and the Mayan language are about as different as Chinese is to Latin. I mean, they're completely non-related languages. So what we do know about the Mayan civilization is they did have a written language. It just happens to be the wrong one. Okay, so we really can't use that as evidence for the Book of Mormon. But in contrast to that, there have been many, many artifacts with written characters and so forth on it. But unfortunately, because of the archaeological community in the United States, both in the 1800s as well as today, the general consensus is that the Native Americans here in North America were just a group of ignorant savages. That term, by the way, came from a book which was written by a guy who was one of three guys who were very much instrumental in trying to actually hide the ancient history of this mound builder civilization. In fact, one of those guys was John Wesley Powell. Lake Powell in Utah was named after him. One was Ephraim George Squires, and the other one is Lewis Henry Morgan. And Lewis Henry Morgan actually was the author of a book called Ancient Societies, in which he says that all human civilizations go through three stages of development. They start off as ignorant savages, they move up to barbarism, and then up to civilization. And it was in that book that he labels the Native Americans as ignorant savages. And that book became the handbook of instructions for dealing with the Indians by the United States government. And according to American Manifest Destiny doctrine, the Indians, because they were this ignorant people, they could be then denied their rights to vote, their rights denied to own land, and they were then looked upon as being a subhuman species because Lewis Henry Morgan was also a very big advocate of another philosopher at the time by the name of Charles Darwin, who basically said that all humans evolved from apes and so forth, and so it was just thought that the Indians were just not as evolved as the Europeans were, and that's why they could take their lands and their rights from them, even though they're surely human beings, same as the Europeans. So that became played into this as well. It's interesting to note, though, that two of those three guys, they were so instrumental, and they became some of the most highly influential men in the United States, in science, in the United States government, in dealing with the Indians and so forth. I mean, John Wesley Powell was one of the heads of the Smithsonian Institution. Later on, he was the head of the Department of Indian Affairs. He was a folk hero after he came out here to the Colorado River and so forth, and he had the ear of every president of the United States until his death. they were using their influence to try to downplay the importance of this ancient civilization that they found in the heartland of America. And why would they do that? One of those things was manifest destiny. But there was another interesting aspect. Two of those three guys, just happened to be born to fathers who were Methodist ministers in Palmyra, New York, in 1830. Why is that significant? What's the chances that a Methodist minister in Palmyra, New York in 1830 had not heard about this upstart young prophet by the name of Joseph Smith and his Gold Bible, which talked about this highly advanced civilization that had a written language and so forth, and had roads and cities and all these accoutrements of culture and sophistication? If they could somehow claim that all the Native American peoples had never attained that level of sophistication or that level of culture, then it would actually undermine the claims of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And they set out to do that. And that we actually have non-Mormon experts who said that there was a deliberate attempt, a wanton destruction of this ancient history and recording it. And that's a real interesting aspect of this, because it's exactly what you would think Satan would probably want to have happen, is to have the history of the Book of Mormon destroyed. But they didn't destroy it all, because in the last couple of years, in fact, there's a show by the name of America Unearthed. This America Unearthed show is on the History 2 channel. The star of the show is Scott Wolter, and Scott Wolter is a forensic geologist. He is the owner of American Petrographic Services out of St. Paul, Minnesota. He's also a openly atheist individual as far as his religious beliefs. But he does the materials analysis for the United States government and for the military and so forth. And there has now been found 7 different either artifacts or locations that have Hebrew writing. They've been very controversial. But he's actually gone to at least 2 of them. For example, one of them is the Bat Creek Stone, which was actually uncovered in an official archaeological dig by the Smithsonian back in 1889. It has characters on it. The characters were originally thought to be Paleo-Cherokee and actually published as such in one of the publications of the Smithsonian Institution, who was in charge of the Mound Survey Project, which actually, why they were doing the digging on these mounds. But then 75 years later, some Hebrew experts came upon that publication and realized that the Smithsonian had published it upside down. If you rotate the illustration 180 degrees, it's perfectly legible Hebrew and translates to "for the Judeans," which is a clear reference to Judah, which is the Old World. And this is found under the head of a skeleton in a mound on just off of the Tennessee River. And the mound dates to 100 AD. And he actually went in with scanning electron microscopy, and then also with the latest technology, which is a 3D digital microscope, and with other experts, and established the fact that there's no way that this stone could have been forged or faked back in the 1800s, because of the fact that where you scratch with a stylus, when you scratch that into the stone, it actually rips away part of the outer crust of the stone, and that is very jagged at first. But over the course of centuries, that will start to erode out and actually become nice, very smooth where that had been. This was so smooth, he says, there's no way that this could have been done in the 1800s, because it would still be jagged from that. So he came to the scientific conclusion that this stone is not a modern hoax. It is a genuine artifact. And how it arrived here in America with Hebrew writing on it, they don't have a clue, but the Book of Mormon has the answer. and it's not the only one. There's one other one that's a really important one. And he also did the same kind of analysis on this stone. It's called the Decalogue stone. It was found in Newark, Ohio in 1860 by a guy by the name of David Wyrick. He was a town surveyor and a very well-respected man of the community. He had 9 individuals that came out. They dug down this mound. They found this stone. When they tossed it out, it went clunk, and so they went and looked at it, and they could shake it, and there was something inside of it. They cleaned it off. They found it had a rim around it, so they took chisels and chiseled it out, popped it open. Inside there was this black stone covered with writing. They took it to some rabbis, and the rabbis looked at it and said, "It's Hebrew." And they were able to actually, they said it's a form of Hebrew we've never seen before because it's so early. But the Hebrew that's on it is definitely Hebrew, and they were able to translate it. And guess what it translates to? The one thing that God requires for the covenant nation to receive all the covenant blessings is to live the 10 Commandments. That's what's inscribed on a stone that came out of a mound that carbon dates into Book of Mormon timeframes. It was so important that the stone, not only did they carve it in stone, but then they carved out 2 other stones, and they sandwiched it so that it would be protected by other stones, so that their children's children's children, generation after generation, would have the one thing that they have to be able to receive every blessing of the sacred covenant with God that's on this nation, that's on this land.